A young revolutionary once wrote that in the big lie, there is always a certain force of credibility, because people are always more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotional nature than consciously or voluntarily. And thus, in the primitive simplicity of their minds, they more readily fall victim to the big lie than to the small lie, as it would never occur to most people to fabricate colossal untruths, and they therefore would never believe that others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously, a fact which is known to all expert liars in this world and to all who conspire together in the art of lying. And while Marcus de Vogelaer and his vehemently anti-patroon faction could not possibly have ever known the author of this particular essay, they clearly shared his mindset. And just as this author knew, so did Vogelaer know that most people, including the powers that be back in Amsterdam, would never fathom that anyone would willingly fabricate colossal untruths with no basis in fact. So yes, Vogelaer and his associates knew that the rest of the company directors would have to take their New Netherland councillors collectively at their word. And if Vogelaer's team could populate that council and the administrative chambers of this colony with willing soldiers toward their purpose, then they could sway the company just enough in their direction to not only unseat this Minuit administration, but perhaps in effect to uproot this entire patroon subcolonizing system led by Kiliaen van Rensselaer. And in keeping with a company policy, 1/3 of all directors needed to resign every 2 years, and as of 1631, this included Kiliaen van Rensselaer, of course providing him with the time to now focus intently on his new and growing subcolony. However, with his departure, Vogelaer and his group would go immediately to work in manufacturing this big lie. Upon Kiliaen's resignation, Vogelaer secured the post of Commissioner of New Netherland Affairs and set in motion a series of appointments of individuals whom he knew would be instrumental in propagating his big lie. And one of the first positions that Vogelaer looked to fill was the one currently held by the expiring term of Minuit's loyal Provincial Secretary, Isaac de Ressier. And Vogelaer's decision to supplant the devout de Ressier with the eager company climber Jan Remunde would prove effective straight away, as the disruptive Remunde immediately began laying his foundation for this big lie, that Minuit and his faction were nothing more than a pack of godless, corrupt degenerates focused in a concerted effort of bilking the company of profits and duping its investors. And the new provincial secretary would align in that effort with the man who considered himself to be the highest rank in the land, yet was given no say in any of this day-to-day bustle that Minuit and his team were ushering along. The now thoroughly disenchanted and disgruntled first minister of this colony, Dominique Jonas Nechelius. But it would actually be the next appointment of Vogelaer's faction that would prove to be the most revealing. And at the geographic core of Kiliaen's own spreading patroonship just happened to be the colony outpost that had been established by another ambitious young man by the name of Jacob Elkins way back in 1614. The New Netherland trading post known as Fort Orange, in what we call Albany today. And Vogelaer knew well that a sound and stable relationship with the man in charge of Fort Orange would be key to Rensselaer's progress in his colonizing endeavors. And Vogelaer thereby conversely also knew that unrest with Fort Orange would go far toward derailing the wealthy diamond merchant's pursuits. And so, Vogelaer and his team would next turn to the man who had come to personify unrest on this turbulent and wild island. No, of course Marcus de Vogelaer and his team could not possibly have known that this essay on the big lie was written by an ambitious 34-year-old by the name of Adolf Hitler, as the Nazi chief wouldn't have been born for another 2 centuries. Yet their psyches were fairly well in sync, because along with unseating Isaac de Remunde, in 1631, the Vogelaer faction also chose to intercept the appointment of the perfectly competent Dirk Cornelissen as commissioner of Fort Orange, with someone who would have likely seen eye to eye with a man like Adolf Hitler, not just in his heart, but in his soul, because his soul was rotten, just like der Führer's. And thanks to the narrow-minded zeal of Marcus de Vogelaer and his ruthless fur-seeking scoundrels, this island was now primed for yet another chapter with the cold black eyes of none other than Hans Joris Hontum. Welcome to Island, our lost American history. The incredible first 300 years of this incredible place that we now call New York. My name is Chance Kelly, and I look forward to you saying, wow, history is cool. Episode 12, Governor. Worthy, wise, prudent, honorable Kiliaen van Rensselaer, since up to this date I have been assisted and favored by your honor, I cannot refrain from advising what I think of the company's affairs and the situation here at present day. As to the building of a certain new ship, which is now almost ready, it proves a success. As to the farms on the Manhattans, much land is being daily plowed. I can also not help advising your honor of the disputes which exist in this small settlement of not more than 200 or 300 people. Now, the governor and Jan Remunde are very much embittered against one another. They let trade slip away, but are very diligent in bringing exorbitant suits and charges against one another, neglecting the interests and business of the directors. The minister, Jonas Michaelius, is very energetic, stirring up the fire between them. He ought to be a mediator in God's church and community, but he seems to me to be the contrary. The honorable directors hear nothing but idle complaints from their subjects, so that in place of the company's servants looking after the trade, someone else in the meanwhile goes off with the skins. The English on the Bay of the Narragansetts will drive us out of the trade, since we go to work so slowly and are so slack in our business. Well, I am no more than a man, and am grieved that I must behold such things as people here so vexing each other. After only a few months with Jan Remunde at the post of Provincial Secretary, by September of 1630, Councillors Simon, Dirks, and Paus had seen enough. This letter to his revered patroon illustrates the specifics of the chaos thrust upon the colony by Vogelaer's gang, which was to apply as much unrest on this island as possible in order to conjure this big lie, and in effect, to uproot this patroonship system, ushered in by the strong-headed Kiliaen van Rensselaer. Of course, it was a natural alliance for Remunde to make with Michaelius, because in his 2 years here, the increasingly embittered cleric, who had initially praised the industrious Walloon governor, had subsequently been soured by the hard and sober existence on this wild and still uncultivated island. And after all, Michaelius was neither a capitalist nor a business-minded soul, but more of a mid-level manager by nature, with a gargantuan ego, voluminous opinions, and an acid tongue. And his praise one day could at any time turn into his perdition, as he wrote a second letter to company director Johan de Forest in September of 1630. We have a governor who is most unworthy of his office, a slippery man who under the treacherous mask of honesty is a compound of all iniquity and wickedness. He has a council at his disposition that obeys with the same iniquity as he commands, for besides cheating our company and having an eye only to their own interest, they also oppress the innocent, and they live so outrageously that they seem not only to be wicked, but even to propagate wickedness. Well, what a difference 2 years can make. And things soon became so acrimonious that shortly after Remunde took office, the normally pious and composed Minuit became so enraged at the new secretary that one encounter had the governor throttling the interloping viper by the neck and threatening Remunde's very life. But for all these mounting challenges, Kiliaen van Rensselaer was no shrinking violet, and just like his soldier father, Kiliaen was a fighter. In fact, patroon number 1 was more than a step ahead of Councillor Posse, because the unity that was now returning to Amsterdam had in fact just delivered Rensselaer's first wave of staff and their families to his embryonic sub-colony. And as of this moment, he was already buying up passage for its very next return voyage to this new world. And now, as an old wise man once said, necessity is the mother of invention, which in many ways is the story of the varied waves of immigration to this land. Because the Walloons are just the first of many oppressed groups who found their way to freedom via the Verrazano Narrows. And the fact is that this bizarre patroonship era, which was essentially ushered in by Piet Hein's Silver Fleet effect, is one of the primary catalysts to centuries of immigration into this remarkable nation of immigrants that we are today. Because while patroons would initially seek out Dutchmen whenever possible, as discussed in Season 1, life had already become very nice in the Dutch Republic, and selling Dutch citizens on the wild and still very dangerous outer limits of this new world required the reliable promise of a definitive upside. Lumbermen and carpenters were in extremely high demand, as were skilled farm workers, and the best of such labor in the Dutch Republic was by now all well employed. And with this particular necessity in New Netherland, so begins a new wave of European immigration, the Scandinavians. Of those whom Rensselaer sent over on the Unity in 1630 were a significant number of Danes and Swedes experienced in the lumber and woodworking trades as well as in farming. And among them was a young man from the remote island of Marstrand off the Swedish coast by the name of Rolof Jansen, along with his wife Annika, and their 2 daughters, Sarah and Treintje, as well as one more child born along the way. Because the Jansens, at the behest of Kiliaen van Rensselaer's momentous endeavor, had come to New Netherland to stay. Also on board was an adventurous 18-year-old whose stated profession was that of surgeon, and whose name was Harmen Mendertsen van den Bogart, an enterprising adolescent who saw great promise and opportunity in this burgeoning colony in the West, opportunity that would in certain ways be realized, because like the Jansens, Harmen van den Bogart's surgeon would also remain in New Netherland for the rest of his life. And a third person of interest on this 1630 Unity voyage was neither Dutch nor Swede, but rather hailed from the very place that Pierre Minuit had called home prior to becoming governor of New Netherland. And her name was Kiliaen Reiniers, born and bred in Wesel, Germany. And Griet had fled Wesel during the build-up of the 30 Years' War, which was, in a nutshell, the final 30 years of the wider 80 Years' War, but as a localized German arm of the conflict between Catholics and Protestants rising out of Martin Luther's Great Reformation. And while this 30 Years' War would uproot a considerable portion of the German state, before these 30 years would end, in 1648, the fight would expand well beyond the German people, with Denmark, Sweden, Poland, and France each and all taking a direct role in this conflict, thrusting many citizens of those nations to this odd and at times tolerant civilization gestating on what was now being called the island of the Manhattans. And so, after fleeing Germany, like throngs of oppressed souls of her day, Griet made her way to Amsterdam, finding employment at the tavern of Pieter van Winter. And like Rolof and Annika Jansen, and like Harmen van den Bogart, Griet too was driven and ambitious in her own specific way. And in her ongoing effort to eke out a living as a single woman in the 1620s, the struggling gal eventually turned to a bit of a side hustle, providing a certain brand of recreational relief to the sailors and patrons who frequented Meneer van Winter's tavern. And in short order, the seafaring brethren of Amsterdam came to know of Griet fairly well. But by then, her reputation had started to precede her a bit more, so that many eligible seamen were careful to steer clear of the overtly racy lass from vessel. That is, of course, until another outcast of sorts became acquainted with the German refugee, one whose surly, brooding nature had acquired for him marginalized status in the narrow-minded purview of 17th century Europe. Because, you see, the particular background of Anthony Janssen van Salie raised eyebrows not just for the lore behind it, but for the dark complexion that his Moroccan mother had imbued him with when she fell for a sailor from Dutch Haarlem one steamy night back in 1606. But then, dark skin was not the only thing Anthony inherited from his mother. He also appears to have been the very first Muslim to have made his way to Manhattan, in a day when the limits of tolerance most usually halted at the opening pages of the Koran, which some say he kept on his person at all times, and for which he earned the lasting nickname of the Turk. However, unlike most of these subsequent eligible men, Anthony saw something different in Griet. 5 years his elder, she evoked for him a maternal energy from behind that adventurous glare in her eye, which ignited a spark in the sad heart of this lost and lonely sailor. After all, for the first time in his broken life, when Anthony stared into the hypnotic hazel eyes of Griet, he wasn't being judged. Her courage and grit not only uplifted the brawny half-Barbary buccaneer, but it also gave him an odd sense of hope that with the right amount of this infectious courage, he could in fact be somebody in this cruel, cold-hearted world. And so, the smitten Anthony applied in Amsterdam for a license to marry on December 15th, 1629, and in short order, the newlyweds were sailing across the North Atlantic en route to their own form of salvation on the western half of the planet. And when the Unity reached Manhattan on May 24th, 1630, Griet and Anthony sauntered down the muddy path of Pearl Street, taking in this bizarre, exhilarating island as the oddly dynamic duo chatted like anxious hawks, evaluating the widening opportunities opening up before them. But then 18-year-old Harman van den Bogart and the Janssens would continue their way north, where they would be gainfully employed upon Kiliaen van Rensselaer's most ambitious project. And when they arrived at Fort Orange, they met a dedicated krankenbezoeker by the name of Bastian Janssen Kroll, who had first come to this remote outpost 6 years earlier and was now actively engaged in buying up as much land from the Algonquins on behalf of Rensselaer as he was able. And so, ever since the Unity returned to Amsterdam from this 1630 voyage, Rensselaer started buying up passage for the vessel's very next trip to Manhattan. And in the bright glare of that brilliant late summer day in 1631, Minuit stood on the dock at Pearl Street, watching the Unity once again drop its anchor, laden with yet another manifest of Kilian's skilled, capable hires and their families. Among them this time was Lawrence Lawrenson from Copenhagen and Barent Tonesen from Norway. And it was then that Minuit saw a familiar face, someone he knew well as a crewman aboard these ships. However, today, Marin Adriansen, upon his fourth visit to this developing island, was a passenger, arriving now with his pretty wife, Lisbeth Tyson, and their young child, because Marin, you see, was moving up in the world, from merchant mariner to tobacco cultivation chief for Kiliaen van Rensselaer. Then finally, Minuit saw a fresh-faced young man by the name of Coenraad Nodelman, a cousin of Rensselaer's and the man who had been sent to replace Jean Lampo as Schout-Fiscal, which is a sort of hybrid between sheriff and legal magistrate, and a pivotal functionary for this gestating civilization. And when Minuit flashed a wide but weary smile welcoming the buttoned-up Nodelman, he soon detected from the gentleman's gaze that along with these farmers and carpenters, the Unity also brought some bad news for Minuit. Because you see, Coenraad knew in his heart that the tales about Minuit were just that. But the company was a conglomeration of many minds and an array of grand egos. And regardless of the fondness that Nodelman's cousin may have had for the industrious Minuit, Nodelman, like all company men, ultimately had to answer to the directors of the Dutch West India Company, a company of which cousin Kiliaen was no longer a director. And so, the 3-block walk to the fort was a somber and awkward one, their boots sinking partially into the pliable but hard-packed mud of Pearl Street, beneath the late-morning concerto of land and seabirds flocking, flitting, and frolicking in the trees along the Strand and over the ocean beyond. And after Minuit led Nodelman through the ungated gates of the still-developing fort, he sat down in the council chambers with the new Schout-Fiscal, who handed him the letter from the company brass, which the proud Walloon read slowly and reluctantly, which ordered Governor Pierre Minuit to report to Amsterdam with this unity's immediate return in order to face an inquest by the company. Also being called back was his brother-in-law, Jan Huggen, along with Dominie Jonas Michaelius, who, like his 2 young daughters, had by now had more than enough of this odd and wild island. Provincial Secretary Jan Remunde had so thoroughly woven that big lie that the directors were no longer willing or able to sit idly by. The company had by now been so relentlessly bombarded by the tales of Remunde and Michaelius that in meticulous Dutch fashion it was ordering the wholesale recall of them all. The only man on Manhattan who seemed at all pleased by the broad action was the jovial Krankenbesucher Kroll, because by now he had grown more than a bit weary of the desolate wilderness at Fort Orange. And with the arrival of the Unity, this ongoing clerical experiment named Bastian Jansen Kroll, the one who had only learned to read shortly before he first came here, 6 years earlier, was now being promoted to interim governor of New Netherland. And in spite of the astounding investment that Rensselaer had by now made in this fully ratified freedoms and exemptions program, Vogler's pack increasingly denied him access to livestock, cattle, and or labor necessary to continue this gargantuan endeavor, as well as blocking any political leverage that Kiliaen still possessed. By now Vogler and his pack were committed to starving Rensselaerswyck out of existence. Kiliaen had been of the understanding that his Rensselaerswyck manager, Dirk Cornelissen, would be installed as the commissioner of Fort Orange by the middle of 1632, when he suddenly heard a nasty rumor to the contrary, as he wrote to Cornelissen, "You thank me that I have procured you the office of commissioner, which I did with great pleasure, conscientiously believing likewise, but as new lords usually make new laws, I have heard a rumor that they have appointed someone else above you. The new lords that Rensselaer refers to are Vogler and his men. And yes, the rumor he had heard was true. They had appointed someone else over Rensselaer's man, someone who knew this island and this land very well, someone whose deviant unrest was now the stuff of dark legend in this new world. And when the calm of dawn was broken that clear morning of April 16th, 1633, the amiable Bastian Jansen Kroll raised his head off his pillow of straw and reluctantly swallowed the fact that his short-lived term as governor at the southern tip of Manhattan Island was now over. Because shuffling his feet upon the slick wooden deck of that incoming ship stood a paunchy 26-year-old, nervously digesting the daunting beauty of this green and still quite untamed island. After all, there was a lot of sugar in the hold below deck, from a Spanish ship they had taken in St. Martin. How much is it all worth? He eagerly wondered to himself, here, on this raw and yet unregulated island. But more importantly, and how much will go in my pocket? Business was a central focus of this young man's family, because his uncle was not just any old businessman. His uncle was Kiliaen van Rensselaer. And as the ship glided and hopped through the moderate ripples of the Narrows, He gripped the port side bulkhead to secure himself, trying not to look directly at the other young man now joining him, just across the deck. For they had tolerated each other to their wits' end these 9 months at sea. And this second chap, ever since Pete Hines' resounding triumph, had been eagerly seeking emigration in both body and spirit to this western half of the planet, ever since those ruminative nights gazing into the cosmos back in Leiden. You see, by the summer of 1630, this impatient child prodigy had left Leiden in order to take command of the post at Fort Nassau in Accra, Ghana, the post formerly held by none other than Domine Jonas Michaelius. And in truth, this visionary prophet was now hot on Michaelius's tail. For all his independence, this young, virile son of God had dropped into one of the greatest groundswells of his time and was rising into his own signature stance atop this catapulting Silver Fleet wave. In his own trademark fashion, he had left his post in Ghana after only 1 year, not for any discredits or demerits, but of his own divinely inspired volition, in order to arrange that upon his 25th birthday, he would transition directly from student to ordained minister of the Dutch Reformed Church. And in gearing up to take his hallowed stature west in his self-appointed mission of cleansing the wicked ways of this still quite unholy new world, the zealous minister-to-be felt that this sacred occasion called for a celebratory transformation of his person, his identity, his essence, thereby Latinizing himself and his entire aura, so that he was no longer the penniless orphan Dutch boy Evert Bogart, but with this ordainment would now transform to Domine Everardus Bogartus, the second official minister of the Dutch Reformed Church of New Netherland. And that shifty chap across the deck was never quite at ease around the lofty young minister. Not that he didn't feel important too. He sort of did. It was just that, well, while he was content with his particular assignment, no matter what he did, he could not quite get around the fact that his only real qualification for it was the fact that he had been born to the sister of Kiliaen van Rensselaer 26 years ago. And as the ship came within a musket shot of that clearing at the island's southern tip, the anxious young man stared in dazzled shock and wonder at the wood fires and the oddly bustling activity of this raw but burgeoning colony. And he marveled at the magnificent windmills, 2 of them now quaintly and concisely bookending this portside village. Skipper Jacob Hess called out commands and the vessel tacked east as the fort drifted behind them when he spotted yet another windmill, one more, on what was being called Neuten Island. And it was at that moment that it occurred to this awkward young man what an unprecedented opportunity this was. And when he turned his head toward the Strand at Pearl Street, it was not the sight of the newish pine planks of the recently installed dock that caught his or any of their collective eyes, but rather the posture of a buxom German woman, provocatively perched atop that dock. And as the paunchy young man shifted his focus from that small mountain of sugar to a decidedly more salacious conduit, the ship drew close enough to be drawn into the hypnotic gaze of this voluptuous gal. And it suddenly occurred to both of these wayward young men that this was quite unlike any place they'd ever been before. And as they came within a stone's throw of the dock, she tipped her ivory chin up toward the Dutchman, calling out to them.
"Welcome to New Netherland,"
she said, addressing him for the first time by his official new title,
Governor van Twiller.
And if nothing else, one thing was for certain, that this nervous little Dutch boy was not in Amsterdam anymore. Island is created, written and produced by Chance Kelly and Dr. Jaap Jacobs. Audio engineer, Sam O'Sullivan. Marketing director, Miss Sophie Basil. And to my friend, the immensely talented Pia Meckler, Danke, Fräulein. Folks, please also join us on our YouTube channel, Island Voices 1 on YouTube, where you can enjoy a variety of engaging interviews, including with our historical excavators. Island is a trademark of Chance Kelly, Inc., Copyright 2023 by Chance Kelly and Yap Jacobs. May not be reused, reproduced, represented, or rebroadcast in this form or in any other format without written authorization. All rights reserved. Damas and Aaron, we thank you for boarding our voyage of discovery en route to saying, wow, history is cool. We'll see you next time.